As we have been doing for the last 10 years, we all love peering. Just to make sure that we are all peering, can we I just want to show you that it takes just 60 seconds to establish a peering relationship. What you need to do, I just want you to do a quick exercise for me. With the person sitting to your left or your right, just introduce yourself, tell them your name, where you come from, or which organization has brought you here. And most importantly, listen to what they have to say, and then give them a chance to tell you who they are. And hopefully this conversation will continue after this. You got 30 seconds to do this. Come on, I want to see some peering here. Okay, excellent. You also need to peer with me. My name is Mathew Chigwende. The company that brings me here is called Liquid Telecom, and I've been doing this attending AFPIF for the last 10 years. This is my 10th AFPIF. I love coming here, trading the London weather for this. I can do it any day. Now I'm just going to bring someone in, Patrick Christian, who is the principal analyst for TeleGeography. All the way from California, Patrick has been part of this AFPIF peering family for the past 5 years, since, was it Maputo? Since Maputo 5 years ago, he has been coming. So Patrick, what he does for us, he keeps us honest with all the data, all the analytics that we do. So we always rely on Patrick coming here, all the stuff from TeleGeography, to see or to verify all the statistics that we see. And today, Patrick is going to talk to us about the shifting connectivity landscape in Africa. Come on in.
Thanks, Mathew. Yes, Patrick Christian, TeleGeography, West Coast, but we'll talk more about that later. Hope you're all surviving the good rum of the region, etc. this morning. 11 o'clock is good. We're feeling a little bit better now. It's great. What I'll be doing is I'll be talking a little bit about infrastructure today, subcables. We'll talk a little bit about maybe growing interconnectivity hubs, and lots of other stuff-ish. So the thing I want to start out with is that I have been, can't look at you when I'm doing this. What I'm going to do is keep continuing what Karen spoke about yesterday in Machuki. How you're going back 10 years for AFPIF, but since Mathew kind of stole the first part of what I was going to say, I've only been here 5 years, so I'll just go back 5 years, because those are the important years for me. But we'll look back about 5 years, and I remember I have to do the little walk back, because it seems like everybody's doing that for the history of AFPIF. So I remember 5 years ago, my first AFPIF, I got here. I was pretty much the only American, only gringo here. Gringo, Mexican term for white people in US. Only gringo, except for this one guy. I'm like, who's that guy? He sounds like he has a Jersey accent. What the? There's this guy, Kyle, from Uganda. I'm like, Uganda, what? Been there how long? So that was my first introduction. And then a couple of years later, actually, nobody from the US, but I was kind of happy about that. 2 or 3 years later, then we started seeing, maybe Andrew was here before me and then came after, but then we saw all this West Coast representation. We have Brett and Brad from my hometown, Phoenix. I mean, who comes from Phoenix to Mauritius for a conference? I guess you guys do. So now West Coast is represented for US, but also I talked a lot about this, or at least a little bit about this, in my first AFPIF. I was representing the west side, so west side of Africa, because that's where I started doing my first research. But now I guess I'm kind of all over. But I guess West Coast this time, West Coast Mauritius, West Coast, east side of Africa continent, I don't know, island, anyway. Okay, good, that's out of the way. So I did it for you, man. So 5 years, yeah. And then actually, just a little anecdote before I start. We were with the Rogers Capital people, very nice, thanks for hosting. Side note, awesome island. This is a great place, great food, super nice people, radical beaches, just beautiful. We have Brett over there who's like drooling. How do you get your waves so perfect? I mean, these waves are perfect. And so it's kind of a distraction sometimes, but after we do the conference stuff. But back to the story. Somebody said from Rogers Capital, how do you guys know each other? So everybody's on the boat talking, and that's exactly the first thing I said when I first came to the first AFPIF, is like, oh, you know each other so well. What is this? It's strange, but now I get it. You go to PIFs all over the world. Every couple weeks there's another PIF, so you guys are all there. And it's like this big, tight community, this big family, awesome family, that kind of knows too much about each other, second family, and you have all the crazy uncles and cool aunts to kind of balance it out. So it's been great. Okay, sorry, I'll get on to the presentation now. So shifting connectivity landscape in Africa and its effect on interconnection hubs. So let's start off with subcable side. But what we're going to cover is we'll cover the subsea landscape, what's shaping the subsea demand and why, spoiler alert, content providers. And by content providers, I know, Shada is like, in CK2, sorry, are like, yeah, we're content providers. But in most of what I'm talking about right now is I'm talking about kind of the big cloud/content providers, OTTs like Microsoft, Google, AWS, et cetera, okay? So we'll be looking at what role do these content players play and where are their new routes, where are we seeing new subcables, et cetera. And then we'll go from there and go to points of convergence, where all these networks are coming together, and what effects it's having on the growth of new hubs. So TeleGeography, you probably know we cover sub-cable systems globally, doing this for a while. And currently we cover over, I think, 440, 450 cable systems, about 100 of which are pre-2000. Then we had another 150 that were activated from 2000 to 2010. In the last decade, about another 200, so quite a few. And as you see, very dense. But let's just look at the last 2-3 years, and it's still actually pretty dense, okay? See a lot of transpac, transatlantic, and surprisingly, I think anyway, a lot of Europe, Asia. But if you look close, what's happened in the last 3 years in Africa? Nothing, okay? Except, sorry, Angola cables, yes, SACs. Okay, but that's not around, but we'll talk about you guys a little bit later. And of course, the subcable providers here are like, yay, but if we want more diversity, more routes, more subcables for all this growth, we're gonna need more. And by the way, Google's cable's not on this because it's just a 2019, okay. 2020, you'll see it. Okay, so now we see the cables where they are. In this slide, what we're doing is we're looking at the used bandwidth, CK. Used bandwidth. And what we can see in this, well, we see growth. Remember, we're just looking at international capacity, TeleGeography, that's what we track. So this is all international capacity. And all of these connecting the regions, we see in this slide, we have the internet backbone bandwidth, but also with the content provider bandwidth. And this, the gold is the content provider, the red is internet backbone providers, okay? Use bandwidth, again. As we see between Europe, US, and Asia, it's pretty much all, or the vast majority, is content bandwidth, okay? The major content providers. But everything south of that, you see, the lines get slimmer, get skinnier, and not as much gold. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about why that is. So kind of same, we're looking at the same data, but in a different way. Looking by route, we see the, once again, the transatlantic route, over 80% of the used bandwidth is content provider, so it's private network, content provider network. Transpac, 70, Inter-Asia is about 70 as well, but we see to South America, Eurasia, and to Africa, around 20%, 25%. Okay, so a little bit less, but growing. Now, in this slide, what we see is, although it seems small to Africa, the growth has been enormous. Of course, working from a smaller base, so it's easier to have huge growth, but Africa is leading for content provider growth compared to all other regions. Okay, so we've talked a little about these subsystems, what's in the pipes. So how is this affecting our content providers, affecting the new subsystems? We're looking at two things. We're looking at inter-data center demand, DC to DC network, and we're also looking at the content distribution and cloud services, the DC to user, two different types of network. The DC to DC is basically interconnecting other data centers. This isn't going to the end user. This is just connecting for mirroring, et cetera, backing up. And the locations of the data centers are usually in areas with favorable regulatory environments, affordable power, low costs, favorable regulatory environment as in lower taxes, et cetera, Ireland, for example. And in areas, these are usually areas with lower bandwidth costs, et cetera. And this just happens to be always Europe, North America, and East Asia. And these are the areas where we see a surge of bandwidth on these traditional routes. Then I talk a little bit about, we're seeing that some of the systems are changing to adapt to this, like landings in Ireland, which there weren't as many before. But then also on the content distribution side, this is the emphasis on distribution to end users, DCs to major hubs and secondary hubs. And this is kind of the interesting part where we see new hubs growing, and it's, I think, fun to track. But on these routes, we're seeing smaller bandwidth requirements than in inter-DC. That's why you see, for example, between Africa and Europe, not as much content provider bandwidth as between Europe and US. And then capacity extending to developed markets and major emerging markets. Like I said again, this is what we'll see in the next couple slides. So right now, since in Africa, well, there's only a couple of big Microsoft data centers. At the moment, we're seeing, a lot of the traffic still coming out of Europe. But we'll look at that in one sec. So why? So what does this look at? Kind of looking at the cause. We're looking at the data centers here. This goes back 2006, 2015, right before it started to jump. We see most of the data centers are in the kind of more developed northern North America, Europe, East Asia, and then not as much below. But we do see in the last 3 years, in Europe, the density of data centers is growing. It's kind of quadrupled, and this is just for the top 3 OTTs. In the US, at least doubled, and Asia doubled, and a couple of interesting things. You see the data center starting to pop up in the Middle East, not an easy place to go, or to deploy this, or to get bandwidth, et cetera. And we see the first 2 in Africa, and sorry, France, I'm sure AWS is underneath the Cape Town one, underneath the blue. But interesting, too, if you look at South America, it's still all just Sao Paulo, but that will probably be changing soon. Now, if we go back to the subcables, the image you saw before showed all the subcables. This just shows content provider submarine cable investments. Okay, so if you see before, these are where all the new cables are coming out. Okay, and the content provider cables. But the interesting thing again is Africa. But now we see, the Google cable appearing here. But we see for South America and Australia, you see the cables around, starting to link up data centers that are being built in these areas. And for new subcable investment, just briefly, if you look at Africa, like we were showing before, very little investment in the last 2016 to present, but it's the second region after Trans-Pacific for 2019-2021. So there's a lot of activity in Africa on the way. Okay, now we switch over to Africa. If you went to GPF, the first part, yeah, okay, we did that, but now we're gonna go all Africa now. Okay, Sub-Saharan Africa, this looks at Sub-Saharan, I'm focusing on. Sorry if you're North Africa, that's a completely different market, much closer to Europe. There's a lot more connectivity to Europe, and since content in Europe is so close, the networks are a little bit different. So for this, as I've done in the past, I'm focusing more on Sub-Saharan Africa. So almost up 6.5 to 7 terabits of international traffic. Remember, international capacity, and this is IP capacity, not just used bandwidth. Growth dropped in 2019 to in the low mid-40s, but dropping to that means you're still doubling every 2 years. So now we're seeing, as it grows, larger base, maybe not growing as fast, but we'll see a lot of growth soon. But all this international capacity, okay, is it within Africa? And that's what we're really looking at, the 80-20 or 20-80. But in this slide, what we see is over since 2002, where the bandwidth is connected to which regions. And we see, if we go back to 2010, if we want to do the 10-year gig, there's very little, a couple of % of the international capacity was actually within Africa. Okay, it's all to Europe. But we are seeing, over the last 10 years, a lot of growth of intra-African connectivity or capacity, but we're still just shy of 20% now. So like 2080, not 80-20, for this data anyway. In this slide, we show where this capacity is connected, okay? And as you can see, 80% of this international bandwidth is connected back to Europe. In Europe, some of the hubs have been changing, moving a little bit further south, so we see more Marseille and Palermo, Lisbon, in these areas. But a lot of these are these traditional routes out of Africa back up to Europe. And the cutoff for capacity on these routes to be in this figure is 50 gig. Okay, now we'll turn to the favorite slide, still an AFPIF exclusive, the intra-African routes. Okay, you may notice, like, compared to last year, you go, wow, those routes look about the same size, but no, it's because the scale has changed. Now, we're only looking at 50 gig or higher, so the same as the previous map, whereas last year, remember, we had to go down to 1 gig to get as much density as we see here. But we see here in the east, okay, East Coast, yes, we see a lot more intra-African capacity. But the West Coast, now we're starting to see a lot more intra-African capacity. I mean, the largest route, of course, is between Accra and Lagos, but we're seeing lots of other small routes appearing. So there is a lot of movement. And I'll come back to this slide in a little bit later to talk about the hubs. And then we see, now we're going all the way from south to north. That's, I guess, liquid up in the north, connecting to Egypt, which was a good segue last year to Ben's presentation. Cape Town to Cairo, bam, did it. Okay. Now, we need the West Coast to East Coast, or East Coast to West Coast. Are you guys working on that? Yes. If we go up, yes, no, not just across South Africa, yes. Okay, if you go up further, maybe Chad, Sudan way, we'll see if maybe routes start to appear through that, but you have to go through Cameroon very often, which is a little bit tricky, challenge. Okay. Now, a lot of what we're talking about, also we're seeing a lot of this growth of capacity and on the internet side, internet backbone side, of course, a lot of this is tied to cost and pricing. So in this slide, I want to put Africa in context with other regions. Of course, we took out on this slide the Europe, US, et cetera, that are already kind of what a lot of people think are normal pricing if you're in the United States or Europe. And we're looking more here at kind of the higher priced southern routes, okay? And you go, oh, Africa, all right. We used to be much above Sydney, the Sydney route, and maybe Singapore, Mumbai. But now Africa prices have been dropping very quickly, especially over the last 2 or 3 years, and especially on the West Coast. And yes, I know when I show this slide, if I have Walt or Chris complaining or commenting that, oh, I can get much cheaper than that. Yes. Okay, this is medians, and this is for one-off sales, and this isn't buying it multiple 10G waves for a content provider that has other pluses that he brings to the bargaining. So yes, these are what everybody else pays, okay? And once again, these are weighted median, so the low, of course, is much lower, but I'll show you on a slide in a sec. But you have passed Sydney, and now kind of catching up to South America. And as I've said in the past, South America is always a good market to look at to kind of see what's coming to Africa in the past. That's what we've seen. Oh, and I have more of an Africa close-up there, although that's really chunky bars and circles. But here we're looking at the three main routes, the Joburg, London, and then Lagos, London, and Nairobi. As I stated a little bit earlier, the big surprise here is just over the last 2 years, how much prices have dropped on the West Coast, okay? Particularly Lagos, London, but also now Johannesburg, London, West Coast is much less expensive than going up the East Coast now. Okay, now we've talked about the networks. Now let's where the networks come together a little bit. In talking about hubs, especially in what we're doing in this type of a conference, let's talk about a little bit about the factors for new interconnection hubs, the ingredients that make the successful and growing hubs. We are looking at international bandwidth, so where the subsea cable systems come together, of course. That's one part, but not the main ingredient, let's say. Also, what we're seeing is you need the carrier neutral DCs and IXs. And where in many markets in, for example, Europe, US, you have many carrier neutral DCs. In Africa, of course, where you have fewer, okay? So it's interesting to track. And I'd love to have a great slide on square meters of white space DC for Africa. But at the moment, we're tracking primarily Europe, Asia, and US, where numbers are big. But now I'm focusing on Africa, and maybe I'll have a good slide. Maybe do I keep on promising this every year? But no, next year, I will have good data on this and can share it with you all, because people like Ranjit and Tunde are helping out right on, and many more, okay? But what else do we need? Friendly regulatory environment, of course, that are helping rather than restricting. We've talked about pricing too, competition, low prices for local connectivity, and rich ecosystems of cable, content, ISPs, chicken and egg, what comes first, et cetera, but usually need bandwidth and a place for the data and competition. So here are a couple of new slides. Here what we're looking at is international IP capacity growth by country to give you a view on some of the major cities and what we're seeing. Once again, this is only looking at international capacity, no domestic traffic, just international. And we see over the last 5 years, 4 to 5 years, growth is big, okay? From 40 to mid-60s very common. Johannesburg is over 1 terabit, and that's, of course, the largest, 64% CAGR. But Lagos has been growing rapidly very recently, seeing them up there as well. But 3 markets where we're seeing top growth of over 70% CAGR from 2015 present. We're seeing Cotonou, but I'm told that was probably before the last election, so we'll see if that continues. but Kigali and Libreville. Okay. Now, looking at the same data but different graphs, so you can kind of look more historically, this is what it looks like, the international IP growth by city. There we see Joburg way out ahead of everybody. But the interesting, some of the interesting cities or lines are Lagos catching up to Cape Town, slightly dépassé or passing it. Nairobi still up there, still growing fast. Mombasa a little bit flattening out, and Kampala's there. Ooh, go Kampala. Okay. So one of the ingredients is having the international capacity, and that's what we were just looking at. Now let's look at the pricing and see where these hubs are, what the growth is. This just compares price changes in the last year. So we're seeing a lot of decline in prices, particularly, like I said before, on the west side. But prices on the east are still fairly low. Djibouti, Marseille, Joburg, London, it can be either way. The cheaper side, of course, is the west side. And Lagos, London is probably had the biggest drop over the last year. And we're seeing now as prices are dropping there, we've seen a lot of activity. And yes, some of you may chuckle at that still over 50, 60,000 for 10G. But once you see, as you get inland away from the coasts. And then for transit, per meg, we're seeing, of course, a lot of drop. Nairobi is actually had the least amount of decline in pricing, Lagos the most, by far. And once again, these are median prices, weighted median. So, for example, like Joburg, you can get a meg. This is at 10G, by the way. This is at 10 gig prices. So you can get below $2, but showing the median about $2.50. So going back to this map again, we'll look at, instead of at the routes, we're looking more at the hubs. We see the hubs that, no huge surprise, see that South Africa, biggest hub, and then we see also, of course, Nigeria and Kenya, the secondary hubs. And we're seeing a lot of growth, interesting growth, in some other areas, like in West Africa, starting to pop up. Accra is kind of or Ghana is kind of a special case. We'll talk about that in a sec. But we're seeing others, even Senegal and Abidjan appearing. And going a little bit more inland, Kampala and Kigali. So hubs, okay, hubs we know, and hubs, will they be hubs or are they hubs? If we start comparing some of these hubs, like Cape Town, Joburg versus Lagos, we've seen the difference over the years. Of course, South Africa, different regulatory environment, a lot of competition. Instead of we're seeing a lot of growth. It's kind of, yes, you have South Africa, okay. But we're seeing in Lagos, completely different, but we are starting to see a lot of change in Lagos. And we've seen over just the last year or so, the prices dropping. And when the prices drop, you're seeing a lot more connectivity, a lot more capacity, and a lot more activity, for example, even in the data centers, okay? Mombasa, Nairobi, and Accra, Lagos. We'll actually do the Accra, Lagos first. Accra, well, Lagos we know the other, I guess, key ingredient is the millions of users in and around Lagos or Nigeria, so that's a big push. Maybe it was a very difficult market to move into initially, but when content providers or look at the possibilities there, it doesn't matter how difficult the environment is, they're going to go in, okay? So maybe that is one reason why we're seeing a lot changing in Lagos the last year or two. In Accra seemed a few years ago that it was going to be growing as a hub just like Lagos, and then kind of calmed down, and now it became more of a transit hub rather than an eyeball hub or a hub where we go up through Accra into other parts of West Africa. But we're seeing a little bit more activity now in Accra as well. And maybe for companies that aren't setting up in Lagos, maybe they'll be going to Accra and peering remotely in Nigeria, We're seeing some activity like that. So we're seeing Accra growing still, more in the last couple of years. Mombasa, Nairobi. Mombasa more maybe a transit hub rather than the eyeball hub, but Nairobi, it's to get to Nairobi. And Nairobi has the onward connectivity, so you can go back to Uganda, Rwanda, and even maybe all the way to the DRC. So there's the attraction there. And then if we compare Djibouti to Mombasa, Djibouti, except for the really cheap cross connects, there's nowhere to go once you're in Djibouti. So once again, that one seems more of a transit hub, okay? And for example, Mombasa, you have the onward connectivity. Djibouti, you're kind of stuck in Djibouti, so you're interconnecting with the other subcables. Except recently, I guess there's been a lot of change, and maybe you can talk about this more than I can, in the markets in Ethiopia. So if you can start having maybe this onward connectivity to Ethiopia, maybe that's a good thing for Djibouti, and we'll see what happens. Maybe Djibouti can grow as not only as a transit hub, but as an eyeball hub. And then Kampala and Kigali, if you go inland a little bit, you see a lot of activity there. Although with, as Kyle is talking about very often, what's been happening with the social media attacks, maybe that's putting a damper on what's going on. But still, for growth, we're seeing a lot of growth to Uganda and Kampala. And in Kigali, now, same type of thing. And there's a lot of activity in Kigali, a lot of build-out. And I never knew, I figured out last year when I went, the connection with Korea. You see a lot of Korean telecoms partnering or helping and laying out all the fiber. There's a lot of fiber there we didn't know about before. And then the last west side, west side. We'll talk about Abidjan, Dakar. These are kind of very new on the radar. Yes, it is very orange country, and we have ACE cable, but we are seeing movement with other carriers there, like Chilean main one, talking about landing in Senegal and Abidjan. More activity for data centers as well, even though really there was only Orange and MTN, but now we saw when we were in Abidjan a couple of years ago, the NSIA is there, and now PAX partnered with them. And the main one's talking about maybe some data centers there as well. And we're seeing in international capacity-wise, both of those destinations are growing. Not only, when I talk about this, I'm doing locations where there are multiple providers and not just one. So some have been left out because there's only one or maybe two providers, but here we're seeing a lot more activity there beyond just Orange. So these are possibilities for maybe West African hubs that are growing. So to sum this up, content providers are influencing new subcable builds. Yes, we're seeing a lot of that, especially on the traditional routes connecting the DCs. But now we're starting to see, as the newer DCs are starting to appear further south, South Africa right now, but maybe we'll see soon or not so soon, but fairly soon in Kenya and in Nigeria as well. Seeing the change in capacity and how it's laid out. And, one question is more GPF, but do these new international subsea systems create interconnection hubs? No, it's just one of the many ingredients. Yes, maybe you need the international capacity at first, but really it's just, depending on where, of course, in Africa, it's, definitely a necessity, but really the local ecosystems, the DCs, et cetera, are very, very important to the growth of these hubs. So the magic mix, it depends. In emerging markets, carrier-neutral DCs, IXs, regulatory environment are just as important as subcables. And we're seeing a lot of growth in this area. So we'll see what happens in next year's slide. Slide. So thanks. If you have any questions, talk to me.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Just stand by for a few moments in case we've got a few questions. Just one from me.
Okay.
You covered a lot on the growing new hubs. What is the correlationship between the new hubs and the price per meg of bandwidth coming out from that connecting to other continents?
What's the connect?
Yeah, the relationship. Do you see a correlation between the bandwidth pricing and also the growth of the hubs?
Yes, I mean, most definitely see. As the prices drop, we're seeing a lot more growth in these areas. And that's another reason, like, for example, in Senegal and Dakar, that they've even appeared on the radar is because just in the last 2 or 3 years, they've dropped prices tremendously. And we're seeing a lot more routes that are growing, a lot more bandwidth being acquired in those areas. So we're seeing that in why we focus a little bit on the growing secondary hubs is because before it was all Lagos or Kenya, but now we're seeing some growth in some other areas, including and even inland more, like Kigali and Kampala.
We'll take just 1 or 2 questions because we are really running short of time. Please go ahead.
Michuki Mwangi, Internet Society. Question on the 20% growth on, or rather, it's 20%. You said 2080.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to know, were you comparing international IP transit purchases versus cross-border or local?
Why?
What was the comparison?
Yeah. The easy answer is because it's very difficult to do domestic, as in non-cross-border. It's very easy, because all of this data, I should have started off with this, is data we collect directly from the big service providers like Liquid, Telecom, et cetera. Andrew spends a lot of time filling out these surveys. I don't know, do you have anything else to do besides? Yeah. It's very hard, and we're sorry. You do an awesome job. And so we do have a little data on domestic routes, but it's all primarily international. So, of course, what this misses is all of the domestic growth or the within-country growth. And this misses, like, for example, the traffic, like cache traffic, et cetera. So we're just talking about international capacity here. We're not talking about growth of traffic within these hubs. And we know that this is happening. And we know that, and I think it was a year or 2 ago when Thomas was here, he was saying, well, 95% of their traffic is from Africa, okay? But the way we track international capacity, we don't track actually the traffic itself. We don't know. We know the capacity on the route, and then we'll get traffic levels, but we don't know exactly what the endpoints are.
So I'd like to have a discussion to see if next year's presentation can sort of look at the local versus the international and actually see if we're getting close to that 80-20.
Yeah, like if you talk to the content providers, CDNs, yeah, they're there. As in a lot of this is within Africa. But the way we track, it's harder to see. Because like I say, we look at international. And it's hard for me. I actually had a slide that I was going to show, but then I questioned it a little bit too much and pulled it. Because I was looking at, as a proxy, looking at the amount of traffic in IXs, okay? And just comparing that with what we're seeing for international capacity. And except for South Africa and a little bit in Nigeria, it's getting better. It's a fraction of the international capacity. And we can't track PNIs. Anything that's on private network, we can't see. So we don't know that traffic, and there must be a lot of traffic there too. So, but if all of you IXs would put your traffic statistics on your website, it would make my my presentations easier. But yeah, I tried to make a slide with that, and there just wasn't enough data. Because Kenya, I'm not sure what's happening in Kenya, but there's not much traffic, and they don't show statistics anymore. And same with Ghana as well. So get those stats out, and then we can have better slides too.
Okay.
Andrew says there's no way domestics are going to
Thank you very much. Another end of applause for Patrick. So we've been talking about the last 10 years of AFPIF. But some people have a crystal ball, and they can look into the seeds of time and see which one will grow and which one will not. Now I need to call upon a citizen of Africa, a believer in innovation, one of the finest brains we have in Africa, and who is lucky enough to share the same organization as me, Andrew Alston, to talk about what will happen in the future.
Good morning. I think it's still morning. It's kind of hard to tell when you spend so much time traveling these days and your time zones get confused, and then you discover you're working at 3 o'clock in the morning. So, good day to whatever time of day it is. I kind of lost track. But firstly, thanks for having me. I'm going to be skipping fairly quickly through the first few slides because they're kind of introductory, and then we'll get to some more interesting technical meat. And we'll see how it goes. If at any point I'm really losing people, ask me the questions afterwards and I'll see what I can do. So firstly, a very quick modern history lesson. When I say this is a modern history lesson, this is just to contrast it to Ben's presentation about Cape to Cairo, where he was talking about railroads back in the kind of 1800s, etc. So this is slightly more modern, 2009 through onwards on 2013 on the submarines. Interestingly enough, there hasn't been that much movement in new cable systems in the last couple of years, but we know there are a lot coming. The cross-border circuits in this picture were kind of limited, almost no cross-border peering, and the content served from the continent was very limited in this time frame. And that's something to keep in mind. The terrestrial map as it stands, though, is very interesting. There is a lot of fiber, and it's growing. That map there was coming from After Fiber, from the NSRC, and you can get the URL for me afterwards and have a look at it. It's an interactive map, shows who owns the fibers, etc. And recently we achieved, Liquid built a Cape to Cairo terrestrial circuit, no submarine capacity. In recent weeks, a company called Paratus has also managed to achieve an east to west, Dar es Salaam to Swakopmund in Namibia, which is it's a major, major deal because it cuts the latency a lot. But we are predicting significant growth in the east to west route, because the thing is, if you want to go from Asia to the States, the lowest latency path is going to be straight through Africa. So we think that Africa is going to become a east to west transit path, and that has very interesting implications and very interesting opportunities. Some trends, the transport prices are still dropping, and the transit prices as well. In 2002, paying $150 a meg in London when we were buying, we're now buying it at sub 15 cents a meg. It's 1,000th of the price. We are seeing a similar trend across Africa, albeit slightly slower, but we believe that by 2030 you will start to see price parity with Europe in the transit pricing. That could also have other implications with regards to consolidation, etc., in the market, because it's a very different market when you get down to those prices because of the capacities that need to be sold to remain profitable and the rest of it. So there are some fairly interesting implications in that as well. Bandwidth trends, this is an interesting one. This data came from one of the speed test sites that takes all their kind of speed tests from all their countries and consolidates it. And we see a lot of bandwidth growth in the speed test data on a kind of per user basis. There were some abnormalities. Madagascar saw an increase of 246% since 2017 in their aggregate speeds. Mauritius has seen 228%. So the islands they've had the cables, but they started using them. And you have, as a result, started to see a lot more uptake in those areas. We've also seen in Gabon and South Africa, where there's been a big uptick in FTTH deployments, there is a fair amount of growth. And while the Gabon line up there might look kind of flat, it's not really, it's just the scale of the graph because of Madagascar being such an outlier, but they've effectively doubled the average speed and in 2 years. So there is definitely movement. Fiber penetration is growing, heavy demand for FTTH services, and while mobile still dominates, will that be the case? What will the impact of 5G be? Now, this is an interesting question. The advent of 5G is going to result in far heavier fiber concentrations because of the density of the base stations. And there is an article actually published in 2012 called "The Future of Wireless is Wired." And we believe that the advent of 5G is going to result in a flood of connectivity. The number of base stations are going to increase, and the complexity of routing and traffic control with that number of devices and routing points out there is going to get exponentially more challenging. So, looking to the future, we see regional hubs at the moment, Joburg, Cape Town, and Nairobi in Kenya. We believe that a Western hub has not really appeared yet. It's still a bit of an open question as to where this is going to be. Lagos, Abidjan, Accra, Douala, all of them are potential options. And the majority of content is likely to be served out of those locations to the countries inland and adjacent to them. So we are watching to see where is the West African side going to really develop, because we're not at all convinced that it's really, from a regional hub perspective, has really become a clear picture. We also believe, as I said, Africa is set to become a transit path, and it creates opportunities and some challenges. So, what keeps us awake at night? Tax, first of all. Very interesting implications with governments starting to try and tax certain content, etc. And it creates some very interesting situations. Shutdowns, becoming far more and more prevalent on the continent. We are seeing more of them. They last longer. Some very bizarre reasons for them. Shut down because of exams instead of telling students not to bring their cell phones. And it gets rather interesting. The policy environment is not getting any friendlier. I wish I could give you good news on this, but it's simply not. Every step forward we take is kind of another step backwards. And you're seeing this in various places. And we're also seeing at the same time the customers are demanding more flexibility, more control, higher service levels in an environment that is constantly mutating. And of course, we keep dreaming about the Africa Free Trade Agreement. Lie awake dreaming this and see what happens. But the customer mindset is changing. Customers are getting smarter, they want more control, they want faster response times, MTTRs have to improve. And as the demands are changing, they're driven by more detailed metrics, latency, cost, in some cases politics. The customers used to want bandwidth. You ask a customer, what do you want? More bandwidth. That's changed. The latency, the cost, the control, where does my traffic go? All of that is becoming more and more prevalent. That creates a whole other situation. So let's talk about dealing with this customer. Firstly, automation is everything. The only answer. And the internet of tomorrow will be driven by customers, not engineers. It will be automated by software. It will not be run by the CLI. And the customers want the control while the provider mitigates the risk. Keep that in mind as I go into the next couple of slides, because it's very, very important to keep in mind that the customer wants the control. But you've got to protect your network and them from themselves in some cases. So the internet of today, how does it work? It's all destination-based routing. Guy says, I am here on the internet, this is my block. Send traffic. He's got no control of how that traffic goes to him across his provider network. It could pass anywhere. It's a destination-based route. And the provider that he's using determines that traffic route across the provider's network to him. And yes, he can prepend, yes, he can play with communities, but it's a very limited ability to actually manipulate route. So, the internet of tomorrow. We believe that customers will have the ability to steer the traffic based on the type at the source. Content type, specific destination, specific application. The provider will set the rules, but will pass the control within the context of those rules to the customer. And the customer will steer based on requirements, not necessarily technical know-how. This means that these rules and the protections have to be fairly carefully defined, and the interfaces to the customers have to be simple, easy to understand, and potentially non-technical. You're not dealing with engineers necessarily who want to reroute this. They're dealing with someone who wants lower latency for whatever reason. And that we believe is coming. So how will this happen? Segment routing and BGP. Customers choose their path. The path gets communicated to the network using BGP extensions from a controller to which the customer is communicating. And the logic behind the controllers and their interfaces will be where the providers differentiate. And network programmability is coming. Now, network programmability. In the network of tomorrow, the customer is going to have the ability to instruct the network to perform tasks, and not necessarily just at the endpoints. For example, you can tag a packet today to tell a router to send you a notification that the packet has passed through it. How much of that functionality you want to expose to your customer, again, is going to become a debate that I think is going to rage for a while and will be different from provider to provider. And the exact methods of doing a lot of this stuff in IPv4 today are clearly defined. This is not theory. It is not hypothetical. It exists. We are running it on our network today. The V6 world, up in the air. There are a couple of methods of doing some of this stuff, some of which impose huge traffic overheads. I'll talk about that in a second. But with the run out of V4 and the changing world where we're moving towards V6, this does create some interesting issues. So, we talk about a paradigm shift. As I said earlier, traffic is destination-based. Now consider the following. In this diagram here, in a normal network, traffic enters R1, follows the routing table to R6. What's in that routing table? IGP metrics, etc., all under the provider's control. And if the engineer wants to know where a packet's going, he can follow the routing table or the label stack. Really nice and simple, right? That's how it works today. But the customer sitting behind R1 has very little, or behind R6, has very little control over what is happening in between. So now let's assume that we give every one of these devices a static label. It's not an IP address, it's a label. Traffic will then come into R1 and impose a label stack on this packet, and the packet will then go label to label to label to label. The customer will be able to tell R1 what label stack to apply. And so when you look at your traffic as an engineer, you're going to have to look at exactly what that stack says to determine where the packet's going, because the packets, that label stack will override the routing table. And it will depend on the provider as to how they let the customers program those stacks, and under what constraints, and under what rules, and on what controller interfaces. That's where the differentiator is. But that kind of control becomes necessary in an environment where governments want to shut down and you want to divert around a country, when you need to avoid a vendor for whatever reason, when you need to get lower latency on a particular packet in your subnet but not the whole subnet. And this level of control is coming. So what changed? So firstly, path instructions are injected via BGP, and it's possible to give customers access BGP to you. Looking at the intermediary routers be meaningless if you don't take into account the label stack, because it's all about what's on the label stack. You can push these paths on a host-based basis because it's not affecting your entire IGP. It is local to the router that contains the path. That gives you a lot more room to move. If I were to try and route on a host-based basis across the entire network, I'd kill all the network because there's simply too many hosts and too many points. This allows me to do that on a host-based basis. And the question then becomes is, how much control do you want to give the customer? It's a tricky balance. And that, as I say, is where the differentiator is coming. But this is coming. The V6 conundrum. IPv6 is supported in the segment routing MPLS. However, certain vendors have stated that MPLS must die with IPv4, and there will be no more control plane development of V6 in relation to MPLS. That creates a problem, because MPLS, particularly on this continent where you need this level of control, is part of life. They want a thing called SRv6. SRv6 in its base form imposes as much as a 19% traffic overhead. Did we not learn from ATM? Effectively, for every 100 gig of traffic, you could be throwing away 19 gig in packet headers. Be interesting for TeleGeography's traffic statistics when actually 19% of the traffic is in packet headers. So there are competing proposals to fix this. I'm sitting in the Spring Working Group at the moment. There is no real agreement on either side, and so we kind of proposed, well, let's write an interop and we can both have our own ways and we'll just interop, and unfortunately I was told by the other side that there will be no interop there, it's their way or the highway. So it's become quite an interesting situation to watch. But Africa has to take a stand here. V4 is running out, and if we don't have MPLS in the V6 world, we have a significant problem. So what works for Africa? Liquid has a view, and there's a URL in here that will make very clear our view on this. And I also, as a matter of full disclosure, co-authored some of the drafts behind one of the competing proposals, but you can read the options, get involved and read and make up your own mind. But what happens is we've got to take a stand, because we can't accept a 19% overhead, in my view, and we have to have something that works for us. So why does it matter to us? First of all, running flexible networks is a change in mindset, and engineers are going to have to adapt. This is the days of an old school network. If the engineers don't adapt, they're going to find themselves in a problem. They're going to simply be out-competed by people who are adapting. The hardware choices that we make are going to impact our ability to move tomorrow more than ever before. Keep in mind that Africa is a growing market. We do not have the same level of legacy hardware that is tying us back. And we're deploying green fields. If we deploy right and we bet on the right things, we will be able to do a lot more in the future. But we have to make those decisions based on what works for Africa, not necessarily what a vendor is selling you on an EU or US-centric mindset. This is critical because Africa has a lot of unique challenges, and we need to think about those. The protocols are new. Some of them are still being developed. We've got to go and make sure, what do we need in those protocols? We have to ensure that the African needs are met right in the protocol base. And networks need to be designed for customer needs, rather than dictated by whatever the rest of the world is doing and handing us on a product. We've got to get involved. And paving the way to tomorrow, if we play our cards right, the lack of legacy technology will allow us to leapfrog the rest of the world. Our skills base will be developed on technologies that have been developed for our needs, rather than skills imported from elsewhere that are targeted for the needs of a different region. It's part of that development cycle. And we believe this is incredibly important that we get involved. So where to from here? With the vendors and the content providers looking to Africa for new customer bases and new sources of revenue, so comes opportunity. We believe in that future where we have two choices: accept what the rest of the world has asked for and asked the vendors for, or use the position that we have as a massive emerging market with 1 billion people still to connect, to use that influence. I was told once by a vendor that all the new features in the routing world come out of the top 10 customers worldwide. I wasn't one of them, and it would never happen. Told me that to my face. Here's the thing. If you can convince the provider that this is the market of tomorrow because there are no greenfields builds being done in the rest of the world, it is simply incremental upgrades, you can influence them because it is their market of tomorrow, even if you don't have the checkbook today. And we need to take advantage of that to ensure that the African needs are met. So some final thoughts. With the market evolving as fast as this one, the time for being passive on our needs and our challenges is over. We have to seize control of our own destiny. We have to innovate, or we will be crushed by those that do. Keep in mind that as the continent becomes more and more interconnected and more intermeshed, you have more and more paths. You are going to have fine-grained control of that. The rest of the world doesn't have a need to potentially divert around a shutdown that's happening every 5 minutes because someone's holding school exams. We do. It's a reality on the continent. There are political challenges. There are geographic challenges. We need to innovate to be able to move around that. Then, as network engineers, we have to keep learning. Because with the advent of machine learning and AI, and I got this statement actually from Kariti Kompella. If we do not keep learning, the machines will outlearn us. And the trick with machine learning is it's important to keep developing networks, but we cannot allow the machines to learn faster than us because else we're in big trouble. And we're the next 1 billion people that are not connected to the net. It's a massive market. We need to leverage that for our advantage. So thank you, and yeah, I'll take some questions.
Thank you very much, Andrew. A comment or question? Come to the mic.
On the microphone.
Good afternoon, and both presentations, fantastic presentations and great perspectives. Thank you very much. My name is Tunde Koka. I'm the Managing Director of Rack Center. I made an observation, question around where is the hub going to be in West Africa? And I'd like to make a clear assertion. I think it's going to be Lagos for Anglophone. Well, I think it's going to be Lagos for West Africa. However, there's also the Anglophone and Francophone aspect of it. And Côte d'Ivoire seems to be emerging as a Francophone hub. And you can see some of the capacity density going into that location. I'd like to put it for discussion, if it's okay. Why? Well, we saw the earlier presentation showing the capacity growth. In a trajectory already in that sort of Lagos angle, catching up with South Africa. That's what the initial presentation showed. Two, of course, Nigeria has to do a lot of work on perception, and so on and so forth. But the numbers show that 20 million SMEs, economically active SMEs in the country, is actually more than the population of Belgium, if you entire population of Belgium. There's a lot of work that's been done on the ease of doing business. I'm just highlighting some of the issues we talked about with sort of taxation, regulatory environments, and so on, and a determination in the government there right now to deal with the ease of doing business issues and get into the top 100. So if we start to anticipate some of those things, the key players in this room will know that they therefore shouldn't miss the potential opportunity of what is, I believe, is going to be an anchor point, but not at the expense of other countries in West Africa, but at the opportunity for other countries in West Africa. Finally, if you look at the map of connectivity, we saw that there's a thickish line actually between Ghana and Nigeria. The direction of travel wasn't shown. The content is going out of Nigeria into Ghana. It is. And if you, from what I hear, and just talking to people, I hear actually that the direction of travel is predominantly Lagos to Ghana. So my assertion in that, and that might be open for discussion, is that the hub will come out to be Lagos for West Africa. It will be at the benefit of other countries, and there will be a Francophone, Anglophone split around the Abidjan axis and that Lagos axis. Thanks.
It will certainly be something I'd like to engage with you afterwards, because there are a couple of interesting points that you make, and there are a couple of counterpoints. I think that it'll be a good discussion to have offline. Feel free to grab me afterwards.
Please go ahead at the back.
Okay.
Sorry, I have to have a headset if there's going to be
Yeah. Please go ahead.
Okay.
Right, thank you. Thank you for giving me the floor. I would like to concur with the other colleagues here and commend you for your presentation. I guess you gave us a nice perspective for internet in Africa. Nonetheless, I do have some concern and pertaining to my country, Chad, and its geolocation. Therefore, what would be your vision given the geolocation of my country? Earlier on, you talk about Lagos for West Africa being the hub. How about Chad? Don't you think that Chad can be of service given its location in the center of Africa in order to make the connection with the north of Africa, for example? So I would like to have your vision and opinion pertaining to this opportunity. Thank you.
So look, the question of a hub and where it sits is an interesting one, because I'm pretty sure that if I were to ask people from Nigeria or from Chad or from Ghana or from Cameroon or anywhere, they'd all say they're the right place. But what is going to drive this, in my view, are a whole number of factors: access to market, the ease of pulling fiber across the borders to the neighboring countries, and that goes to political relationships of the hub countries to their neighbors. And can you get agreement to pull fiber? It goes to a regulatory environment. It goes to political stability. For example, if I'm sitting trying to pull fiber across a war zone to get out of the country, that's going to be a problem. I'm not saying that's the case in any of these places. I'm saying that these factors are multifold, and it is not a simple exercise. And very often, hindsight is 2020, right? If you look at it, you're not actually sure where this is going to end up. And what we are saying is not don't invest in these countries at all. We are saying that we're waiting to see where this hub develops while deploying all over the place. I mean, you know, we are making very strong plans to invest in these places. We're just not 100% sure how this is going to play out because of the multitude of factors. And I don't think that in any way this is set in stone yet. I think what is really going to determine this is where do the content providers go, and not just the big Western content providers. When you look at Tencent, when you look at others, and the investment coming from the East, that could also have a huge impact on where this ends up. So it is quite a difficult thing to predict at this moment. And as I said, you know, right now it's an open question.
Hi, Andrew. Nish, I'll go with a curious person. Thank you. That was interesting. I have one short question which requires a yes or no answer only. Given that we've been listening to this talk about dropping costs, and those of us that have been in operations know that customers care about paying less for more, do you think that customers are going to be willing to pay more to be able to do the sort of thing that you're describing?
I can't give you a yes or no. I can give you a brief answer. I would say that on the base connectivity side, probably not. However, for the limited services on a time-based offering, etc., there are cases where they will take an uplift in a particular service to say that I want to take this particular address, I want it on an ultra-low latency path with ultra-high QoS, and I want it for the next 4 hours to achieve something, and they will pay extra for that, 100%.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Okay, applause for Andrew. Thank you very much. So last but not least, we have one more presentation from Logan. Logan is with Afrinic, looking after, he's a security engineer and also working with IETF. I will not steal the thunder, I'll just let him talk about ECN.
Okay, so I'm going to be as short as I can. So I'd just like to state before I start that those views are my own and they do not reflect Afrinic or Cyberstorm, but I'm going to talk about later. So as Andrew mentioned, if we're going to talk about the future, we need network to rethink how QoS is currently being done. And for a long time, if you look at the history of TCP/IP, it's been 30 years old. It's actually older than me. And if you look at the current work being done at the IETF, people are talking about QUIC right now. However, before we go into massive deployment of QUIC, you still have customers who want more interactive services, more and more over the internet. So ECN was something that was built in the last decade. It's basically a way of saying you have a receiver and you have a sender. So when the sender sends too much traffic, instead of dropping the packets, we say, we're experiencing congestion, please back off a little bit. When it was first deployed, there were massive issues with some of the CPE equipment deployed out there, meaning the routers and the modems, that would crash. So ECN, despite being very old, has seen very, very slow deployment. One person described ECN as the wet paint of internet. Recently, there was a huge push, and you have to understand that, as Andrew mentioned, more and more people are now on wireless. So Apple started experimenting with ECN, and then it enabled ECN on all of its products and its CDN. Why would Apple do that? Okay? The ECN major advantage is that, unlike packet loss, it's unambiguous. You're explicitly saying we're experiencing congestion somewhere down there. Okay? So what are the benefits of ECN? If you have, compared to 10, 20 years ago, you have much more people now using wireless. So retransmitting over wireless, it's kind of a bit painful. What if the packet is halfway across your network and then you just mark it instead of retransmitting? Okay? With ECN, your interactive services over TCP can be faster. You can have a slight throughput increase, and it's all in the RFC. I'm just summarizing it here. And interactive services benefit. And for network engineers, it's actually easier to see because the header is actually being set. And last point that I'm going to elaborate a bit more towards the end is you can, through ECN, you can develop new ways to react to congestion control. And there are many competing proposals within the IETF. And why does it concern us here? Because the future of TCP/IP is being decided by a very small group of people. And this is going to impact you here. So now that I've introduced ECN, I'm just going to introduce two competing proposals. So the problem that people have seen with ECN when it's deployed is that it's a little bit too aggressive, because once you see the CE as written in the RFC, you have to back off aggressively. And that's an issue for some people. So some people came up with the idea of, instead of having ECN, how about we have a signaling mechanism that's milder, that's less strong than ECN. And they call it SCE for some congestion experience. The problem with SCE is that it requires a code point assignment within the IETF that collides with another work known as L4S. So what you have now is the development of TCP/IP taking place in the IETF with two competing proposals that have different meanings for how the last code point for ECN should be used. And this is decided by a very small group. There are not many people involved. I'm aware of Linux developers, the FreeBSD developers involved, David Reed, who was the inventor of UDP. There are people from Akamai, and the other side, L4S, you have cable companies that are talking about this, that are pushing their own proposals at L4S. And among this, we have a group in Mauritius, Cyberstorm, which has been working on SC and a little bit on L4S to see how we can implement that into FreeBSD and Linux. And you have to understand that it's 30 years old code, so it's very, very old, and you have to go through it and make those changes and come up with reports. So my message to you is that instead of having only a small group decide about the future of TCP/IP, how about we get more people involved, because the impact is going to be on your network eventually, okay? So getting into a bit into SC and L4S. So L4S was designed basically by, from DCTCP, which is a kind of a variant of TCP designed for data centers. As I said earlier, it collides with SCE. So instead of having SCE saying, we use this last free code point for ECN to say some congestion is being experienced, and you're going to back off less aggressively. And all this ties in, whether SCE or L4S, it's about modifying TCP/IP, the core protocol, to have better latency-driven experience for customers. I've seen a lot of people talking about bandwidth, and not many people talking about latency. Okay? And I hope that we'll see more people, rather than not only in Mauritius, but also in other parts of Africa, getting involved in the transport area working group. Sometimes the discussions were very aggressive, as Andrew explained. And we have working code for ECN. I have a working prototype for FreeBSD. There are other people in Mauritius working on different prototypes. And you can, first thing is you need to start thinking about, if you're blocking ECN on your network, think about the benefit that it can have for your customers, and you can spend some time as an operator testing it and then sending the feedback on the IETF mailing list. If there's benefit for you, speak about your results. Don't stay in a corner. One thing that Nishal keeps saying is that we compete on commercial level, but on technical level, we need to collaborate. And if you have some time, I encourage you can set up FreeBSD VM with the SE prototype that I have, and I'll be happy to talk later to you. And then share the results, because what's happening in the IETF Transport Area Working Group is going to affect you eventually. So better you're involved now rather than late. So it might surprise you that while the development is taking place in the IETF and taking place in those venues, but with the development of the internet in Mauritius, we had sponsored connectivity from Mauritius Telecom, and taking a bunch of really young people, getting them to read the RFCs, getting them to read 30 years old code, and experimenting with Wireshark, it's a great experience, because I'm no longer that young. So I'm trying to pass on what I know to other people. And it's the key part of, we have TCP IP, but do 16 or 18-year-old people understand how TCP IP works? And having them involved in the IETF remotely is a game changer for Africa, I think. Thank you very much, and happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Logan. Any questions at all? Oh, we had to add one question.
Logan, so firstly, I do not want to turn this into a complex IETF debate. So let me just ask you this, though. So if you look at something like ECN, which is very good on a host-based level, on the intermediary routers for congestion control, etc., it's never going to fly, because you're never going to read that deep into the packet, because if you do, you've got a CPU punt and the ASICs aren't going to work, etc., etc. So my question is, if you look at some of the newer technologies, when you're looking at path segment options in SRv6 and network programmability, etc., and using the host end options and the path segment options to do this, why not do this at the higher level of the stack rather than so low down in the stack, which potentially could have impact, considering that the options do exist to interact with the host on the network programmability level without going that deep in the stack?
Yes, you do that as well. I completely agree. There are different prototypes floating around. There's even one vendor, Aruba, who has been working on a switch that responds to SCE using P4. And again, it would make sense to do it at a higher level. And I guess what you're saying fits into something like, why are people doing quick, right? Because it's at the higher level, it's easier to update and things like that. So on that point, I agree with you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Is there any other question or comments before we finish? This is just what is standing between us and lunch.
Yes.
My name is Kevin Chege from Intersociety. A question and a comment for Logan. First question, where can we find all the work that you're doing, you know, the code you're saying that you've tested and so on? How can we find it? Second, if you don't mind, a question back to Andrew's presentation that has just come to mind. Andrew, in your presentation, you said you see the future of the internet being, you know, customers selecting where their packets go on the internet, yeah? My question, and this is in relation to sort of end-to-end connectivity, because I know you've thought about it. What will that mean for the reliability of the internet if the customers have more control on where their packets flow? Do you see anything, you know, that causing more breaks on the internet or more mistakes that lead to, you know, routing security issues? And in terms of, you know, the work that you're doing, I know you have written code on the, you know, the draft that you did. It looks like there's a group right next to you that might be able to help you testing that code. So, you know, the two of you, I think you need to work together on some of the work you're doing. Thanks.
So, with regards to whether or not this could cause more instability, the answer to that is going to be, as I said multiple times in the presentation, how much control does the provider give to the customer and under what rules? The way that I envisage this is that, yes, it is potentially possible to send an announcement that could seriously break the routing for a particular block by imposing a label stack that doesn't exist. The way to solve this is to, firstly, you've got path validation that's got to happen when the customer says, choose this path, validate the path. Secondly, you're not going to say just pick anything. You're going to have a series of options that are going to check this, because if you don't, you're right, it could cause problems. And that's why I say what will differentiate providers here is going to come down to what is in that controller, how much are they giving to the customer, under what protections, and how are they able to handle the inter-ASN relationships as well, because that's key to end-to-end as well, being able to pass this. So it's away from coming on a wider spectrum across providers. It'll get there, but the instability aspects of it are going to come down to how good are the providers' programmers. And keep that in mind. It's very important, because in a future world, a network engineer that cannot program because of things like this is going to be out of a job. It will be a case of development like this, and setting the rules are going to be the name of the game going forward. So if you're a network engineer out there today, I have a suggestion for you. Go start learning to code, because it's going to be fundamental to your job going forward. I promise you now.
Change your role. Thank you very much. Okay, final hand of applause to Patrick, Andrew, and Logan. You've been a very, very good audience. Thank you very much.